Prison Writings. My Life is My Sundance by Leonard Peltier. Part 4. Becoming Political. During the siege at Wounded Knee, more than 250,000 rounds were fired at our people by U.S. Marshals, FBI agents, the tribal police, the goons, and white vigilantes. These boys weren't kidding. And neither were we. Chapter 19. In 1959, when I was 15, my mother moved to Portland under the government's relocation program. I saved money for the bus fare and headed out west to join her. I remember when I got to Portland, I had exactly 10 cents left to my name and a phone number my mom had given me to get in touch with her. I wandered around Portland, fascinated by the tall buildings and the busy waterfront. It could have been a different planet for all it resembled the res. I soon hit out on my own, working for a time in California as a migrant worker, before winding up in Seattle, where I worked for a time at a construction job, then became part owner of an auto body shop. We used the second floor above the garage as a halfway house for Indians in need, and there were always plenty of those. We started doing repair jobs for friends for next to nothing, and before long we got so deep into debt that we had to close the shop. My one attempt at capitalism was over, scuttled by that old Indian weakness, sharing with others. It's a practice that means we're rich as a people, but poor as individuals. I remember one night, while watching television, I caught a segment on the local evening news in which a young Indian woman was screaming and crying, blood running down her face from police batons as she was arrested for taking part in a protest for native fishing rights. The police were brutal as they arrested these people, who were only trying to protect their traditional rights. I saw native children being pushed and knocked around, falling down on bloody knees as they tried to defend their parents' fishing nets and boats. It tore at my heart to hear their shrill, terrified cries as they pleaded desperately with the police to leave their nets and boats, their very livelihood, alone. As I watched in growing amazement, utterly outraged, I learned that these native people of the Northwest were simply trying to maintain the rights clearly guaranteed to them under formal, still binding treaties with the U.S. government. All through this turbulent time, I had seen what the government was willing to do to innocent people if they perceived these individuals to somehow be an economic or social threat. The sportsmen and commercial fishers were complaining. They said the Indians were harvesting too many fish, in actuality less than 1% of total harvest. They demanded it be stopped, regardless of whether or not the native people had a legal right to fish the lakes and rivers, and regardless of the fact that in exchange for that legal right, and little else, they had given away virtually the whole of the Pacific Northwest. The TV report showed, by sharp contrast to the Indian fishermen in their little craft, the 2 to 3 mile long nets and huge fishing ships used by the commercial fishermen. To press their rights, local Indian people staged the series of fish-ins that had prompted the other side's vicious campaign of government-supported violence against them. Although I'd been staying away from politics to earn a living, that scene I just witnessed on TV was an awakening to me, an electric shock to my dormant native soul. Even though I was young, I felt I could no longer ignore the native struggle, so long as one Indian was being mistreated. Like so many others who were shaken out of their submission and lethargy and indifference during the 1960s, I joined the fight for civil and human and Indian rights. I decided that wherever I went in America from that day on, I would do everything possible to help my people. Chapter 20. The government, for much of the latter half of the 20th century, had tried to get rid of us by dumping us into the multicolored racial refuse heaps of the inner cities. But the unintended result was that relocation created a new current of ideas between the outside world and the isolated reservations. This new underclass of urban Indians quickly grew politically savvy, becoming part of the broad spectrum of activist, even militantly activist movements that were springing up throughout the society at large. Instead of reacting defensively to white man's chosen terms like termination and relocation, Indians on and off the res began talking seriously and passionately about sovereignty and treaty rights, about reparations and the return of ancestral lands. The American Indian Movement, AIM, was born out of this turmoil. First in Minneapolis, founded by Clyde Bellecourt, Dennis Banks, and George Mitchell, all Ojibwe graduates of the Indian Finishing School, the Minnesota State Penitentiary, then spreading to other urban centers around the country and attracting, in fact, creating a whole new rogue gallery of Native activists. The attempt to destroy us had only made us stronger, more aware, more dedicated. Every one of us was willing to lay down our life for our cause, which was the very survival of Indian peoples. From these roots, my involvement in a continuing array of AIM-style political groups and activities was assured. The growth of the Indian movement and the history of AIM are intertwined with my personal history. In the mid-1960s, I worked in the Northwest with the Indian fishing rights struggle. In the late 60s, I was active in the anti-war movement. In 1970, even while the Alcatraz Island takeover was still going on, we laid claim to surplus Indian land outside Seattle at Fort Lawton. We found our inspiration and our strategy in the example and message of AIM leaders such as Dennis Banks, John Trudell, Russell Means, Eddie Benton Benai, and Clyde and Vernon Bellecourt. All imperfect men, no doubt, yet men whose visions and bravery and fiery, even incendiary words gave voice to a whole generation of Indian activists, myself included. And so out of seeming death came new life, a new vision, a new flowering of Indian way. Instead of disappearing, dissolving as a people, as we were expected to do, we found a new social consciousness and a new sense of ourselves in the political cauldron of the cities. Out from under the big brother eye of the BIA on the reservations, we became politically streetwise. This was the time, remember, of the anti-Vietnam War movement and the New Left, of Black Power and Kent State and Watergate, of the Symbionese Liberation Army and the Weathermen. The notion of Red Power was inevitable. We didn't even have to invent a cause. We had one we'd been born with. The very survival of our people as a people. A new generation of spirit warriors was being born and raised in the racial morass of America's cities. Tough young men and women with brains and conscience and eloquence and guts they were willing to spill on behalf of this implacable upstart notion, the people. Yes, the people. This wasn't communism. We didn't give a damn about the communists. This wasn't anti-Americanism. We expected nothing from America except that it live up to its own laws, its own constitution. This wasn't anti-anything. This was pro-Indianism. Something new, an intertwining of traditional Indian way and spiritual values with urban political savvy and an absolute dedication to our cause. The government finally abandoned its utterly failed termination policy. They saw it wasn't working and that we were just getting stronger, more hardened. So the termination policy was stopped, but we knew the government would quickly regroup and look for other ways to destroy us. Chapter 21. AIM was a trivial annoyance to the U.S. government in that tumultuous era. Politically, we were nowhere in the national consciousness, much less conscience. America really didn't give a damn about Indians unless we staged takeovers like Alcatraz, Fort Lawton, the BIA building in Washington, D.C., and Wounded Knee. Even the public was more amused or temporarily outraged than really concerned. Their ignorance and indifference allowed and continued to allow a cancer to grow within the American body politic. The federal government, or to be more accurate, certain elements within it, set out to destroy us in a myriad of subtle and not-so-subtle ways. They hid behind their usual cloak of national security to do their dirty work. Their first tactic? Forget the law. The law's for suckers. Subvert the law at will to get your man, however innocent he may be. Suborn the whole legal and judicial systems. Lie whenever and wherever you have to keep the focus of inquiry on your victims and not on your own crimes. I have to admit, they succeeded brilliantly. In the name of law, they violated every law in the books. And in their deliberate strategy of putting me and how many other innocents away in a cell or in a grave, They turned the Constitution of the United States into pulp fiction. By the late 1960s, we were tired of the government setting the political agenda. We decided to set the agenda on our own. When I say we, I mean each of us who became involved as individuals, whether urban or reservation Indians, or those like most of us who were caught between. There was no overarching formal organization following Robert's Rules of Order. There were only individuals and groups of individuals of like mind working together in a kind of pure democracy. A disorganized but vaguely coherent collectivity of leaders. That's what AIM was and is. Not a subversive plot, not a radical mob, but a collectivity of leaders, working in loose unison, using material means to accomplish a political and spiritual purpose. Our people's survival. People often ask me what my position is, or was, in AIM, the American Indian Movement. That requires an explanation. AIM is not an organization. AIM, as its name clearly says, is a movement. Within that movement, organizations come and go. No one person or a special group of people runs AIM. Don't confuse AIM with any particular individual or individuals who march under its banner, however worthy or unworthy they may be. AIM is the people. AIM will be there when every one of us living today is gone. AIM will raise new leaders in every generation. Crazy Horse belonged to AIM. Sitting Bull belonged to AIM. They belong to us still, and we belong to them. They're with us right now. I've heard a lot of criticisms of AIM's often conflicting leaders and spokesmen over the years, of men such as Dennis Banks and Leonard Crowdog, and Eddie Benton Benai and the Means brothers, and the Bellacourts, and John Trudell, and the others. I can tell you none of them was or is perfect, any more than I was or am. But I can also tell you these were men who stood for the people when the time came to stand up. They could have walked away, averted their eyes, turned their backs, and taken the easy way out. They didn't. Each of them stood alone against all odds and took the blows that were directed at their people. They accepted the suffering of their people as their own. They lived that suffering. Whatever their imperfections were and are, we should honor these men. They changed the course of history. They gave us the pride and belief in ourselves that we so desperately needed and craved. They made a flesh offering of their very lives on behalf of the people, and they taught the rest of us to do the same. They proved that we exist. But even more, and with even deeper gratitude, I want to honor here those whose names aren't so well known. Those who manned the barricades at Alcatraz and Fort Lawton and Wounded Knee and Oglala and 1,000 other places. Those who never got into the headlines, but whose dedication and bravery and selflessness are what being Indian is all about, what AIM is all about, what the spirit of Crazy Horse is all about. Each of them, man and woman, child and elder, stood tall at times of great danger and greater sacrifice, with no expectation of any personal fame or reward. Nor did they ever receive any. They did it for the people, because it had to be done, because there was no one else to do it. For many of them, the only recognition was to have their names scratched into a makeshift headstone. But then it's not really accurate for me to say that I honor them, for it's they who honor me, they who honor us all. One other point I want to make about AIM. There are no followers in AIM. We are all leaders. We are each an army of one, working for the survival of our people and of the earth, our mother. This isn't rhetoric. This is commitment. This is who we are. Chapter 22. In November 1972, we brought our grievances to Washington, D.C. in a mass demonstration for Indian rights. We called that cross-country march and demonstration the Trail of Broken Treaties. It was our hope and intent to set up a series of wide-ranging meetings with government agencies to discuss a 20-point spectrum of crucial issues, including an overhaul of the BIA, putting it under Indian control, and also the establishment of a commission to examine treaty violations by the U.S. government. What was to have been a peaceful meeting turned into an impromptu sit-in when government officials, reneging on their promises to see us, had BIA security guards try to oust us from the building. When the security guards started using strong-arm tactics on our women and elders, the sit-in escalated into a tense confrontation. We were not about to turn and run. The spirit of Crazy Horse was with us. We seized the BIA building right in the center of downtown Washington, allowed all employees to leave peaceably, and occupied it for 5 days, much to the outrage of the American public, who were, as usual, totally misinformed as to what had happened, or why. We were portrayed in the press as thugs and hoodlums, and violent militants. Yes, we sacked the BIA building, looking for, and finding in abundance, files that would reveal the government's duplicity in dealing with Indians. We piled up desks and anything else we could find to build our barricades against the government's threatened assault. We broke sealed windows so that tear gas couldn't be used to suffocate us and force us out. The police themselves broke most of the lower floor windows. Sure, some younger guys, infuriated by the government's lies and brutal mistreatment, started just breaking things up. We quickly put a stop to that. I remember Clyde Bellecourt announcing that for every broken window in the BIA building, there were 10,000 hearts the BIA had broken in Indian country. He should have said 100,000, even 1,000,000. That would have been near the mark. One old grandfather, a victim of the BIA throughout his life, took a fire axe, jumped up on the BIA commissioner's big mahogany desk, and split it in two. He laughed and wept ecstatically, all the while singing his death song as he chopped. "There! Take that! And that! And that!" he cried between his gasps and his chants, righting an ancient wrong with every blow. It was beautiful. He was Crazy Horse incarnate in that moment. Outside, the police and SWAT teams were gathered. If they wanted a bloodbath, we were prepared to give them one. We were ready to rain down desks and typewriters and filing cabinets and Molotov cocktails if they stormed the building. Some of the warriors put on their war paint. Every one of us was Crazy Horse. Seeing our resolve, the government itself had second thoughts. Murder 400 Indians in a massacre a few blocks from the White House only days before the 1972 presidential election? No way. The FBI decided to end this thing for the moment, then hunt us down later one by one, which indeed is exactly what they did. That's when my name as security chief during the BIA takeover appeared high on their list of secret targets as an AIM agitator and key extremist. I'd already been arrested during the Fort Lawton takeover. I was permanently marked. The government finally started negotiating with us, but only to end the occupation of the BIA building, not to resolve our original 20-point list of grievances. We felt that we'd made at least one point, that point being that we exist. We'd proven that. The government promised to look at our grievances, they never did, and they also promised not to prosecute us for the BIA takeover, a promise broken like all the others. We didn't believe them anyway. To defuse the situation and end their own embarrassment, they actually provided vehicles and an early morning police escort out of town, plus under-the-table money to pay for our travel expenses. Some of the elders even received first-class tickets back home. The government thought they were sweeping us under the rug. But this time, we were not about to be swept. Chapter 23. After the BIA takeover, I went back to Milwaukee where I had moved in 1972 to become employment manager for a local AIM group. I found jobs for Native people in trade unions and worked in an alcohol rehab program. I also became increasingly involved in the spiritual side of AIM, the spiritual basis of the political work we were doing. You really can't separate the two in Indian way. The political and spiritual are one and the same. You can't believe one thing and then go out and do another. What you believe and what you do are the same thing. In Indian way, If you see your people suffering, helping them becomes absolutely necessary. It's not a social act of charity or welfare assistance. It's a spiritual act, a holy deed. In Indian way, we have our warriors and our peace chiefs. Both do holy work. But even beyond that, on a personal level, every Indian, every one of us is a warrior and a peace chief. We each seek peace, yes, even reconciliation with the dominant society. But we're also each and every one of us ready and willing to fight to the death for the survival of our people. Each and every Indian, man or woman, child or elder, is a spirit warrior. In Milwaukee, I became involved in a curious and unsettling incident. We had just returned a few weeks before from the BIA takeover in Washington, D.C., and I was out with a couple of bros having a meal at a local eatery. A couple of men at a nearby table started pointing at us, snorting with laughter, and tossing out a whole slew of racial slurs and innuendos. No way of knowing they were plainclothes cops. When we went to leave, those two guys stood right outside the front door, blocking our way, still pointing and snorting and belly laughing at us. There was nothing subtle about it. They were baiting us, actually. Much more than I could know. I looked the two of them over. I knew we could beat the shit out of them. "What's so funny?" I asked them. I was mad as hell and ready to get it on, since that's what they obviously wanted. But the instant I said that, before I could get off a single punch, the barrels of two .357 Magnums were pointed right at my head. The two bros split, and I reeled back into the restaurant, figuring they might hesitate to shoot me in front of witnesses. "I give up! I give up!" I yelled out, hands in the air, so everybody could hear and see. They finally announced they were police, manacled me on the spot, dragged me out, and tossed me headlong into the back of a paddy wagon they already had waiting outside. They frisked me, found an old busted Beretta I'd just bought off a guy for $20, hoping to get it fixed. The cops later said I'd pointed that pistol at them, and tried to fire at them several times, point blank, but the gun jammed. That was a lie, of course. The very lie that got me the phony attempted murder charge. As was later proved by the court, the pistol, as both they and I well knew, was broken and unusable. I never went for it, even for show. I wound up on the steel floor of the paddy wagon, chin on the floor, hands manacled behind me, my head wedged under the seat bench for protection from their blows, trying to shield myself as they beat the hell out of me. I lost track of how many times they punched, kneed, and kicked me. I later learned one of them, poor guy, busted up his hand so bad he had to take a few days off. So you see, that's how it's done. Target us, set us up, arrest us, beat the shit out of us, hang a phony rap on us, drag us off to court and jail, impoverish us with legal expenses even if we never did a damn thing. That, we later learned, was what the FBI called neutralization. So let me tell you, so long as you have nothing but contempt for the law and the U.S. Constitution itself, it can be a very effective strategy indeed. Much later, during the Milwaukee trial, we learned that one of those cops' girlfriends had listened to him bragging the night before about how he was gonna catch a big one for the FBI while waving a photograph of me in her face. I could see the continuing setup in the works. Phony charges, phony trial, phony conviction, and all prearranged. All I had to do was play victim for them. I wasn't about to do it. My people, at that very moment, were at a crossroads in our history. Every one of us was needed for the confrontation at hand. Even as I sat, manacled for 5 months in a Milwaukee jail on those phony charges, the lid blew off on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. The occupation and siege at Wounded Knee had begun on February 27th, 1973. I wish I could have been there. Before the jail bars shut with finality behind me, I jumped pretrial bail, which a few friends had surprisingly managed to get for me in late April, and shortly thereafter I slipped out of town, later becoming a hunted fugitive when I missed my pretrial hearing. I felt no more guilty running from my oppressors than a Jew in Nazi Germany would have felt guilty running from the Gestapo. Like them, I was being targeted for being who I was. Not until 1978, after I had already been convicted and imprisoned on that other set of false charges stemming from the 1975 firefight at Oglala, would I stand trial on those original phony attempted murder charges in Milwaukee. I was found not guilty. Government misconduct had been so overt and clumsy in that case that the jury acquitted. By that time, of course, I was already 3 years behind bars on other phony charges. The first set of phony charges made me a fugitive and got me on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, and also set me up for a second set of phony charges that put me behind bars for these 23 years. The same hardened criminal who had dared to speak his own language and practice his own religion as a boy was now, as a young man, being hunted like an animal. Really, more maliciously than any animals ever hunted, because of 2 crimes he never committed. 2 crimes that were, in fact, fabricated by his very accusers. My life had abruptly turned into a nightmare, and that nightmare hasn't lifted to this day. Years later, documents uncovered by my lawyers under the Freedom of Information Act revealed the FBI plot to have local police put Ames leaders under close scrutiny, arrest them on every possible charge. We were, quite simply, in the FBI's own choice of phrase, to be neutralized. That explains the assault on me by those 2 cops in Milwaukee. Hey, they were just doing their job, joining in an illegal government conspiracy to frame and imprison, if not outright murder, a whole generation of Native American activists. And that's just what they did. Chapter 24. The siege at Wounded Knee was in its very last stages when I got out on bail. I had every intention of going there to join my besieged brothers and sisters. My heart and soul were aching to be there with those people. The day I got out of jail, I joined an AIM demonstration in front of the federal building in Milwaukee, then began organizing supplies for the people in Wounded Knee. We were on the way there with the supplies when we heard on the radio that the siege was over. I felt downright guilty at having missed it. I would gladly have died there, but now there was no need for that. My time of sacrifice would come soon enough. Wounded Knee ended after the deaths of 2 of our AIM occupiers, Frank Clearwater and Buddy Lamont, by sniper bullets. After the government promised to hold hearings on the violations of the old treaties, the traditional chiefs of Pine Ridge decided enough Indians had died. The elders who had asked AIM to come there in the first place to protect them from the depredations of the tribal council and its paramilitary hit squad called Goons, Guardians of the Oglala Nation, agreed at last to end the occupation. On May 9th, after 71 days, the weary but still proud occupiers agreed to come out, submitting to a prearranged arrest. Wounded Knee too was over, though its repercussions continue to this day. It remains the watershed event of modern red-white relations. According to court records, during the siege at Wounded Knee, more than 250,000 rounds were fired at our people by U.S. Marshals, FBI agents, the tribal police, the goons, and white vigilantes. These boys weren't kidding. And neither were we. After my release from the Milwaukee jail, I shuttled between South Dakota and Washington State, keeping active in the struggle. That August of 1973, I attended Sundance at Crow Dog's Paradise on Rosebud Reservation, just east of Pine Ridge. There, I was finally pierced for the first time, realizing the dream I'd had since that day as a teenager when I had peeked through the tent flap at the Turtle Mountain Sundance. I felt transformed, elevated to a new spiritual plane. Now I had not just given my time and my effort and my dedication to my people's cause. I had given my flesh. That same month, a formal warrant for my arrest was issued after I failed to show at my scheduled pretrial hearing in Milwaukee. I was now officially a fugitive, but there's many a nook and cranny in Indian country where a skin on the lamb can find refuge. We can slip back and forth across the invisible but very real border between the United States and Great Turtle Island. You could say I escaped for those months to Great Turtle Island. Fugitive or no, I made myself useful to the ongoing struggle. For a time, I rejoined the fishing rights battle of the Nisqually and the Puyallup peoples in Washington state. Even though the courts had ruled in our favor on the matter of Indian fishing rights, the sports and commercial fishermen continued to bust up our boats, destroy our nets, and beat up Indian people, all without fear of being arrested. Since the law wouldn't protect us, we did our best to protect ourselves. Then I headed back to South Dakota to serve on security at the funeral of the martyred Pedro Bisonetti, the main spokesman for the Lakota traditional chiefs at Pine Ridge, who was killed by BIA police shortly before he was to testify for the defense in the trials growing out of Wounded Knee 2. The following May, I returned to Rosebud for a time to serve as security chief for Crow Dog's revival of the old ghost dance ceremony, a visionary renewal that gave us a powerful sense of spiritual connection and interplay between Wounded Knee 1 of 1890 and Wounded Knee 2 of 1973. I felt drawn as a spirit warrior to every confrontation. In January 1975, I joined in the takeover of an unused abbey in Gresham, Wisconsin, by the Menominee Warrior Society. The following month, I joined an 8-day takeover of a manufacturing plant that had been mistreating its Indian employees on the Navajo reservation in Arizona. A delegation of Navajo women came to AIM and told horrendous stories about a group of Navajo protesters, men and women, who had been brutally murdered. It just tore my heart out to hear these women beg for help. Again, we did our best to help them. Yes, I kept busy. Not much grass grows under a fugitive's or a spirit warrior's feet. Chapter 25. After Wounded Knee, life on the Pine Ridge Reservation became even worse than before, turning truly nightmarish. The goons increased their terrorist attacks upon traditional Indian people and their supporters. AIM members were being killed, maimed, and wounded. 260 casualties have been documented to date. A 9-year-old girl had her eye shot out playing in front of her log home when the goons drove by and machine-gunned the house. The murder rate proved astronomical for a reservation of barely 20,000 people. From 1977 to 1978, the General Accounting Office investigated and documented 60 murders of Indians occurring between 1973 and 1975. They eventually stopped counting, and the investigation was terminated due to lack of funds. That terrible era is remembered even today as the Reign of Terror. In March 1975 alone, 7 people were killed by violence, all deaths unexplained, even though by that time the FBI had more than 50 agents swarming over the Pine Ridge Reservation. Prior to 1973, they had only 2 or 3 agents in the area, if that. Seems like the more FBIs we had around, the more murders we had. The call went out from traditional Oglala Lakota elders from Pine Ridge, requesting that AIM come to the Oglala Nation and help protect them from these attacks. A number of warriors, myself included, volunteered to go. However, we went with the understanding that we were in no way a military or paramilitary group. We weren't there to attack or kill or intimidate anybody, only to stand between the goons and the traditionalists with our bodies, our prayers, and a small supply of defensive arms. We called ourselves a spiritual camp, and that's what we truly were. We were spirit warriors, not mercenaries. We wanted peace, not conflict. The violence came from the other side, not from us. It was entirely unprovoked and obviously long planned. It also, obviously, went very wrong. I can't believe that the FBI intended the deaths of their own agents. Their sorry excuse has been that those 2 agents blundered and trespassed onto the property that morning simply in order to arrest someone falsely accused of stealing a pair of used cowboy boots. That simply doesn't wash. They didn't even have a warrant for his arrest, nor does it jibe with the fact that scores, even hundreds of FBI agents, federal marshals, BIA police, and goons were all lying in wait in the immediate vicinity. It seems they thought they'd barge in on that phony pretext, draw some show of resistance from our AIM spiritual camp, then pounce on the compound with massive force. They miscalculated. which proved tragic for all of us. In the midst of that reign of terror, which they themselves had orchestrated, with carloads of government-armed and equipped goons shooting up the reservation day after day, we AIM Spirit Warriors weren't about to just sit quietly and wait to see just who it was in those two unidentified cars that came roaring unannounced in a cloud of dust and confusion and flying bullets into our compound that morning. We defended the people we'd come to defend, and we also defended ourselves. We refused to be passive victims. Someday, the true reasons for their ill-conceived assault, what really was going on, will come out. The answer or answers, if they haven't already been shredded, may lie in those 6,000 plus FBI documents they admit to having withheld to this day, both from us and from the American public, on the grounds of national security. Lately, I understand they claim those documents have been lost. Certainly, it was no accident that the day before the gunfight at Oglala, the head of the non-traditional tribal government was signing over to the federal government 1/8 of the Pine Ridge Reservation, now known as the Sheep Mountain Bombing Range, reputably rich in uranium deposits. Many of us believe that the shootout at Oglala was specifically intended as a diversion to conceal that illegal deal, which wasn't revealed to the public for nearly a year. The public furor over the death of the two agents also conveniently scotched a planned congressional investigation of what had happened at Wounded Knee 2 in 1973 and the subsequent reign of terror on the Pine Ridge Reservation that led to the Oglala firefight on June 6, 1975. The FBI's later assertion that we somehow decided to ambush its agents is absurd, as they well know. We had women cooking, kids playing outside, all of our belongings, clothing, and personal items left behind. In fact, we now know, again through the Freedom of Information Act, that 1 month prior to the firefight at Oglala, the FBI had issued an internal memo concerning paramilitary law enforcement operations on the reservation. They had obviously long been gearing up for such an assault against us, and they just as obviously bungled it terribly, to their own subsequent grief, as well as ours. Chapter 26. Since that time, the uranium mining opposed at such high cost in the early 1970s has proceeded insidiously. Lakota people today drink contaminated water and experience a rate of miscarriage and spontaneous abortion 7 times the national average. Our sacred Black Hills, according to the master plan, were to have been declared a national sacrifice area. Ultimately, were the plan to proceed, to be ringed by more than a dozen giant coal-fired plants and 25 nuclear reactors. A cat's cradle grid of power lines was to be flung across the Pine Ridge and Rosebud reservations in order to carry the power eastward. Court challenges to the horrendous environmental impact this nuclear monstrosity would inevitably cause have, blessedly, slowed the enactment of the plan. So has the drop in uranium prices caused by the end of the Cold War. But when the uranium market starts moving up again, watch out. The energy interests are simply biding their time for the most profitable moment to begin yet again. The death of a people and of a way of life, not to mention the death of the land itself, never enters into the considerations of those who would foist this abomination on the Lakota people and the people of America as well. That's why the FBI would come down on us so hard, because AIM and the traditional elders were the only ones who stood in their way. Everyone else either didn't know, didn't care, or had sold out. I have no doubt whatsoever that the real motivation behind both Wounded Knee 2 and the Oglala firefight, and much of the turmoil throughout Indian country in the early 1970s, was and is the mining company's desire to muffle AIM and all traditional Indian people who sought and still seek to protect the land, water, and air from their thefts and depredations. In this sad and tragic age we live in, to come to the defense of Mother Earth is to be branded a criminal. By pulling the necessary strings, these companies manage to stoke the government's fear of internal enemies and co-opt the energies of the FBI and BIA, federal agencies that are sworn by law to protect us, not exploit and destroy us. I think the FBI actually thought we were a danger to the national interest in that paranoid era. If they were really concerned, however, about the national interest, why hasn't the government investigated the companies that engineered all this turmoil in the first place? The only thing we ever endangered was the profits of the multinational energy consortiums that were looking on our sacred Black Hills as their new private energy fiefdom. And the only ones in their way were a few stubborn-minded, dirty Indians who kept stupidly insisting that the treaties be honored and that the U.S. Constitution be the law of the land. I was and remain proud to be one of those dirty Indians. I've been called that all my life, anyway. I have always stood with the traditional elders from the reservation hinterlands and the Amers from the urban red ghettos, where we'd been dumped so those corporate thieves could get at the uranium and the gold and the coal. It's no accident that the Bureau of Land Management supervises the BIA, which supervises us. That's a mighty handy arrangement for the energy interests. Just butter up a few small-time, low-salaried officials at the BLM and the BIA, maybe a few higher-up state and federal legislators as well. And through them, the progressive tribal council factions, willing puppets of the government, would sell out the people for some quick under-the-table cash anytime. When the traditional elders objected, they were beaten, shot, burned out of their homes by the goons hired by the tribal council. When the elders called the AIM boys to come help them, sure enough, the FBI was called into Pine Ridge in massive force. They armed the goons with the latest military weaponry and gave tacit approval to the reign of terror that soon swept the res. And all of this, for whose benefit? I've often wondered what the FBI boys got out of all this, except the hatred of Native Americans and the disrespect of their own people. And what must they think of themselves, those who partook in all these manipulations and fabrications, when they look at their face in the mirror each morning? They must shudder at the sight of themselves, avert their eyes from their own gaze in the mirror. So they have to live the lie they created in order to maintain an aura of pride and self-respect. Or perhaps their arrogance builds an impregnable wall of delusion. Their own unwitting complicity in the deaths of their own agents they will never admit to. That, at least, is human. We can't live with the contempt of others. None of us can. To save face is a quintessential human need. I can understand that, and I can understand how the FBI hallows its own. To them, Collar and Williams are fallen comrades, heroes, tragic victims, and true martyrs. But we too hallow our own. We too have our fallen comrades, our heroes, our tragic victims, our true martyrs. And we have them in countless numbers. I live with the wail of their voices in my inner ear. I hear them always. I can't forget them. I refuse to forget them. They are victims of the energy wars, as were the agents, Collar and Williams, as am I. And so are you, my friend, and your children, and your children's children. The FBI itself is a victim of the energy wars, having strayed far beyond the bounds of legality and human decency in its misguided eagerness to serve the interests of the multinational investors and their continuing assault on Mother Earth. All these things are acts of war against the Lakota people, against all Indian people, against all indigenous people everywhere, against all humanity. We must continue to oppose these forces of destruction with every fiber of our being, with every breath we take.
Till I see you again, my friend. We'll Sundance in the wind. Please forgive us, Mother Earth. Being blind at first. Now we see the damage done, and we undo what we have done. Folks big coat.